Brothers and sisters, imagine this. A president handed 12 pages of paper, unsigned, written by strangers, each line a command to bow, to apologize, to surrender. They called it diplomacy. He called it chains. 12 pages demanding silence in the face of bombs, in the face of hunger, in the face of a history 400 years long where Africa was told to whisper while others shouted. That night in New York City, the world expected him to fold. Instead, he folded their script in half. This is not the story of a man reading words written for him. It is the story of a man who tore the mask off global hypocrisy, who stood in front of 100 nations and refused to say sorry for being African, refused to say sorry for demanding dignity, refused to say sorry for telling the truth about Israel, about France, about the invisible war that strangles his continent every day. And in that refusal, something extraordinary began to move, first in Burkina Faso, then across Africa, then in communities as far away as Harlem, Port-au-Prince, and Sydney. But let us pause here because the question is larger than one man. What happens when an entire people silenced for centuries suddenly decide they will no longer apologize? What happens when dignity becomes more powerful than dollars, when pride becomes more dangerous than weapons? For those of you watching, especially my American elders over 60 who remember civil rights marches, Vietnam protests, and the long battle for respect at home, does this not feel familiar? Do you see in this story of Burkina Faso an echo of your own struggles? Please stay with me. Share this if you feel that truth matters more than headlines. Subscribe if you believe that the dignity of a people can never be negotiated. Because this is not just about one speech at the United Nations. This is about whether the world will accept Africa standing tall or demand it kneel once more. The pressure did not arrive in whispers. It arrived stamped on the letterhead of the United Nations Secretary General's office. A formal note accusing the president's last speech, where he condemned the bombings in Gaza and drew parallels to the cries of mothers in Mali, Congo, and Niger of causing diplomatic tension and undermining cooperation. In polite words, they were saying, "You went too far." And so they summoned him, not to speak, but to clarify. But clarification was never the point. They wanted a confession. Within days, the mask slipped even further. Calls poured in from Paris, from Washington, from Tel Aviv. Each one carried the same rhythm: polite concern, quiet warning, veiled threats. "We can reconsider development aid if you're willing to walk it back. Surely, Mr. President, you don't want sanctions." Then came the draft itself, 12 pages unsigned, written by hands that believed they still owned Africa's voice. 4 pages apologizing for tone, 3 pages apologizing for language, 5 pages reaffirming shared values. But whose values? The kind that let Belgium never apologize for Congo, France never apologize for Algeria, Israel never apologize for its role in African conflicts. One night at 2 a.m., the pressure knocked directly at his door, not through official channels, but on his personal phone, a line known only by 5 trusted people. A voice introduced itself as Ambassador Richardson from the U.S. State Department. 20 minutes later, a black SUV without flags or plates rolled into the palace. Richardson entered with 2 silent men, placed a leather briefcase on the desk, and spread its contents like a gambler laying down cards. Satellite images of Burkina Faso's gold mines. Financial records of Chinese infrastructure deals. Reports on Russian advisors whose presence had never been publicly acknowledged. We know everything he said, and right now we're calling it cooperation. But it could be something else, something dangerous. This was not subtle diplomacy. This was a threat wrapped in leather and satellite ink. The message was clear: soften your speech or face exposure, sanctions may be worse. But the president leaned back, calm. He asked the ambassador, when America invaded Iraq, did it apologize first? When France intervened in Mali, did it ask African permission? When Israel bombed schools in Gaza, did they draft apology scripts? Each question was a knife, each answer a shrug. Richardson closed his briefcase and left with his shadows, but the warning hung in the room like smoke. What followed was not submission, but strategy. The president turned to his security chief. How many Western operatives were being tracked in Ouagadougou? 17 confirmed, likely twice as many hidden. How many phone lines compromised? All of them. But for 3 months they had been fed false information. The president smiled. Good. Tomorrow leak a story that I am reconsidering the UN speech, that I might even read their apology. It was a trap, and the West walked straight into it. CNN ran with the headline, "Burkina Faso leader may soften stance." The BBC quoted unnamed diplomats claiming he was open to compromise. Washington congratulated itself, whispering that the pressure campaign was working. They did not know that at that very moment, 50,000 citizens were filling Revolution Square in Ouagadougou. Old women wiping tears, young men chanting, children waving flags they barely understood, but they all felt it, the electricity of dignity. Standing before them, the president declared, "They think Africa still begs for permission to speak. They can freeze our aid, they can write their speeches, they can draft their sanctions, but they cannot make us kneel." The roar shook the night air, and the message was clear. This was not going to be another story of quiet compliance. This was going to be the confrontation of truth and hypocrisy, staged not behind closed doors, but before the world. The trap was set. The world believed he was flying to New York with an apology in his pocket. Instead, he was carrying a defiance that had been waiting 4 centuries to be spoken aloud. When the plane touched down at JFK, he expected silence. Instead, 200 members of the African diaspora were waiting, waving homemade signs that read, "Africa doesn't apologize, and he speaks for us." A young woman barely out of university ran beside the motorcade shouting, "Make them hear us, President." He rolled down the window, meeting her eyes. In that moment, he knew the speech was no longer his alone, it was theirs. Inside the United Nations chamber, the atmosphere was suffocating. Delegates from over 100 nations filled the hall. Some smirked, expecting a humbled man with 12 pages of contrition. Others ignored him, flipping through papers as if nothing important was about to happen. Cameras zoomed in. The young leader adjusted the microphone and began. "I have been told to apologize," he said calmly. "Before you ask me for my apology, let me ask you this. How many times have you apologized for what you have done to Africa?" Silence fell. Not the polite silence of diplomacy, but the heavy silence of guilt unacknowledged. He pressed on. "Did Belgium ever apologize for Congo? Did France ever apologize for Algeria? Did Israel ever apologize for training militias that destabilized our region?" A ripple of discomfort ran across the hall. One delegate shifted in his chair, another scribbled notes that no one would read. Then came the pivot that no script could have predicted. He pulled a phone from his pocket at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. Security guards tensed. Delegates stared. "I want to read you something," he announced. "A message I received this morning from a 12-year-old girl in Ouagadougou." He read aloud, "Mr. President, my teacher says you're going to America to speak for us. Please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African." For a moment, the chamber was paralyzed. The innocence of a child's words hung heavier than any policy paper. Looking up from the phone, he declared, "That child has more dignity than this entire assembly." And then the reversal. "You want me to apologize? I will. I apologize that it took this long for an African leader to speak without fear. I apologize that my predecessors were forced to choose between sovereignty and survival. I apologize that our children were taught to seek permission before they could dream." The room leaned forward, unsure. Was this contrition? But his voice sharpened. "But I will not apologize for refusing occupation disguised as diplomacy. I will not apologize for rejecting partnerships that leave my people in poverty. I will not apologize for being African and proud." At that, the mask shattered. The French delegate stood and stormed out. Others avoided his gaze. Cameras caught every twitch, every discomfort. He did not pause for applause. He didn't need it. He needed them to hear, and they did. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, the African Union convened an emergency session at the Ethiopian mission. 43 ambassadors gathered not to beg for aid or negotiate trade, but to draft a new doctrine. By midnight, they had produced the New York Declaration, a pledge that no African state would ever again accept conditional aid, apologize for defending sovereignty, or allow foreign powers to dictate domestic policy. Within 2 days, 12 presidents had signed it. But the true eruption was in the streets. In Nairobi, students declared a Dignity Day filling campuses with debates on sovereignty. In Lagos Market, women refused to sell goods tied to companies supporting Israeli settlements. In Accra, musicians turned his words into songs pulsing from radios across the city. In Cape Town, artists painted murals showing a chain of African leaders in Nkrumah Mandela, and now this young president with the words, "The Unbroken Chain." The speech had begun as a confrontation inside a chamber of marble and microphones, but the real chamber was the continent itself, and the applause was the roar of its people reclaiming their dignity. The retaliation came swiftly. Within 24 hours, the European Union announced it was freezing $27 million in development funds earmarked for Burkina Faso. The International Monetary Fund postponed a long-awaited debt relief review. French media launched a smear campaign labeling the young leader a dictator in disguise. In Washington, think tanks issued sharp warnings. Burkina Faso risks isolation unless its president learns the art of diplomacy. But inside Ouagadougou, the message was very different. Crowds filled Revolution Square once again chanting, "Isolation is independence." To them, the freezing of funds was not a punishment. It was liberation, the proof that their leader's defiance was real, that they were no longer tethered by invisible strings of foreign aid. The ripple spread across the ocean. In Port-au-Prince, Haiti's prime minister called directly, "You have given us permission to remember who we are." Within a week, Haiti withdrew from all World Bank structural adjustment programs. Jamaica soon followed, then the Dominican Republic, then Trinidad and Tobago. The Caribbean, long considered the backyard of global powers, was stirring awake. Across Africa, civil society surged with new energy. In Ghana, youth activists launched the Sovereignty Tour, a series of town halls teaching communities how foreign interference shaped politics. In Nigeria, thousands of young people filled social media with one question: when will our leaders speak like this? In South Africa, lawyers filed cases demanding sanctions against countries complicit in supplying weapons to African conflicts. In every corner, the speech became less about one man and more about an awakening. The most visible transformation, however, unfolded at home. For decades, Burkina Faso had been described as aid-dependent, its farmers dismissed as backward by Western experts. Yet 6 months after the UN speech, the nation announced something historic: complete food security. Not because of foreign consultants, but because Burkinabe farmers returned to traditional methods, seeds adapted to Sahel soil irrigation, rooted in ancestral knowledge rotations designed by generations. Harvests doubled, crops grew resilient. The symbolism was unmistakable. The same country whose leader refused to apologize to the UN was now feeding itself without UN help. Grandmothers who once queued for imported grain now spoke proudly on national television, "We are no longer beggars. We are farmers again." Children in schools were taught not just mathematics, but the story of how their families' techniques had saved a nation. Pride was no longer abstract. It was edible, visible in markets overflowing with local produce. This new posture inspired governments across the continent. 17 nations renegotiated their mining contracts, ensuring higher profit shares for locals. 23 created sovereign wealth funds to capture value from natural resources. 31 launched indigenous technology programs. 42 signed intra-African trade agreements, bypassing Western middlemen entirely. In each of these moves, the echo of that UN speech resounded. It was not just defiance, it was competence proof that Africans could chart their own economic futures. And that competence frightened Western capitals more than any angry words. At its core, the political and civil aftershocks revealed a profound truth. Apologies were not just symbolic gestures, they were instruments of control. By refusing to apologize, the president severed a psychological chain, and millions realized they no longer needed permission to stand tall. What began as one man's rejection of a script had become a people's rejection of dependency. And in the markets of Lagos, the town halls of Accra, the courts of Johannesburg, and the farms of Burkina Faso, Africa, was no longer whispering. It was roaring. In Washington, the silence after the UN speech was not relief but alarm. A confidential 12-page State Department memo later leaked summed it up with one chilling line: "The Burkina Faso model represents a fundamental threat to Western influence in sub-Saharan Africa." The assessment warned that if this model spread, the traditional levers of control, aid packages, debt negotiations, military bases could become ineffective within 5 years. For policymakers accustomed to assuming African dependence, this was an earthquake. The panic was justified because the dominoes were already falling. In Tanzania, the government announced that all mining contracts would be renegotiated to ensure 60% of profits stayed in country. In Zambia, leaders declared copper exports would go only to nations that recognized Palestinian sovereignty. In Senegal, officials gave French military bases 90 days to leave. Each decision carried its own local rationale: economic sovereignty, diplomatic independence, but the subtext was clear: Africa had stopped asking permission. For American officials, this shift was deeply unsettling. For decades, U.S. foreign policy toward Africa had oscillated between neglect and paternalism, assuming African governments needed guidance or rescue. But suddenly, here was a young leader dismantling Western talking points with precision, invoking international law and drawing applause not from diplomats, but from ordinary people in Harlem, Nairobi, and Port-au-Prince. The cultural reverberations inside the United States were equally telling. In Harlem, a mural appeared overnight, the silhouette of the Burkina leader against a map of Africa, 3 words in red, no apology given. On black radio stations from New York to Atlanta, hosts played clips of his speech calling it the boldness they had longed to hear. For older African Americans, many over 60, the echoes were unmistakable. They remembered the civil rights movement, the speeches of Malcolm and Martin, the years when truth spoken aloud could shake empires. To them, this African president was not a stranger. He was family, a son of the same struggle. Globally, the resonance spread even further. Indigenous communities in the Americas cited his speech in land rights campaigns. Aboriginal activists in Australia invoked his words in sovereignty rallies. Small island nations in the Pacific, battered by climate change and centuries of exploitation, began to speak of refusing to apologize for survival. What had begun as a rejection of one draft speech in New York had morphed into a global refusal to kneel. For Western analysts, this was the most dangerous development of all. Defiance they could dismiss as youthful bravado. But competence, strategic, eloquent, historically grounded competence, undermined the narrative of African incapacity that justified centuries of interference. If Burkina Faso, long described as one of the world's poorest nations, could redefine sovereignty with such clarity, what would happen when Nigeria, South Africa, or Egypt chose the same path? In editorial pages across Europe, commentators worried aloud. Is this the beginning of a new non-aligned movement? In Washington, think tanks debated sanctions but feared backlash, and in living rooms from Lagos to Louisiana, ordinary people asked a simpler question: why should anyone apologize for dignity? The world had been forced to look at Africa not as a problem to be managed, but as a voice to be reckoned with. And once that door was opened, there was no shutting it again. When his plane descended back into Ouagadougou, he saw them from the window, thousands lining the roads, not to protest, not to beg, but to welcome him home. Families holding children on their shoulders, elders leaning on canes. They carried no political banners, only handmade signs. We are proud. At Revolution Square, an old man, perhaps 80, pressed forward through the crowd. Security tried to stop him, but the president waved them back. The elder tapped on the car window, and when it rolled down, he whispered in the local tongue, "I fought for independence in 1960. Today, you made that fight worthwhile." From his pocket, he pulled a small scrap of cloth, Burkina Faso's first flag raised when the nation claimed its freedom. Placing it in the president's hand, he said, "Keep this. So you never forget, freedom is not a gift. It is a choice you make every day." That night, alone in the palace, the young leader spread that faded flag across his desk. The realization struck him deeply. This was not the end of a chapter, but the beginning of one. The UN speech would be remembered not as the day Africa apologized, but as the day Africa refused to kneel. And here is the warning. The world will not easily accept a continent that stands tall. Sanctions will come. Smear campaigns will multiply. Offers of comfort will be dangled, always with hidden chains. But the choice remains the same: dignity or dependency, freedom or permission. For those watching from America, especially elders who marched in Selma or stood against Vietnam, do you recognize this moment? Do you see how the struggle of Africans today mirrors the struggles you carried decades ago? If so, then you know what is at stake. Because the next time a Western diplomat demands an apology, the answer will echo from millions, not just one. No apology for being African. No apology for demanding justice. No apology for refusing crumbs. So I leave you with this question: do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's defiance marks the birth of a stronger Africa, or will the weight of retaliation break this momentum? And more personally, can we as global citizens continue to accept apologies demanded from the powerless while the powerful remain silent for their crimes? Please share this if you believe that dignity is more important than aid. Subscribe if you believe the truth should outlive propaganda. Comment your thoughts below, because history is being written and your voice is part of it. No apology, no surrender, just Africa risen.